It's day one of a brand new metagame, and I gotta tell you, things feel more open right now than they have in a long time. With the removal of Techno-Organic Virus from the metagame, the most dominant mid-range deck has been relegated to a stature that is a lot lower than you might expect, but there are plenty of ways to try to build around it, and a lot of the more interesting moves in this early day one metagame are to try to figure out how to maximize Techno-Organic Virus's new form. Now that it's no longer tied to Mobius and becomes tied to Quinjet, that encourages you to go different directions with it. I've seen people messing around with Virus in V-Hand, and this list from Butt is aimed at dealing with all of the other mid-range decks by going under them by playing things like Loki, discounting a ton of energy, and taking advantage of the fact that because Virus is no longer coupled with Mobius, many people are not actually playing Mobius. And I think that's probably the number one thing about this metagame that you should probably be paying attention to as it develops in High Infinite is that there is not a lot of Mobius, which means there are a lot of people doing Quinjet TOV things, and a lot of people are exploring this space because it's what basically just got introduced to the game. And so you have this list from Butt, which is aimed at being a little bit better at doing that than the other lists, thanks to cards like Gambit, Horseman of Death, Juggernaut, and of course the typical Wilson Fisk debris package. This is a deck that is built to be a version of this kind of list, of a new TOV list that beats the other versions of new TOV. It is notably weak to Mobius, but many of the other things in this space are going to end up also being weak to Mobius. The second thing to pay attention to in this new metagame is that Captain Carter did not eat a massively significant nerf, but also that Shadow King is still an incredibly popular and powerful card. While the specific versions of Techno-Organic Virus have decreased in number, there are still a ton of Shadow Kings running around High Infinite, making this a bit of a harder sell. However, this is still an extremely powerful level 1 deck that should be a very good choice for anyone who wants a simple, straightforward, and powerful list to climb with in an early, fairly confused metagame. I think that this list has a real chance at breaking out, although it is still fairly complex to pilot and does require a lot of will they, won't they with the typical cards that interact with it. Once the metagame becomes more settled and you have a better sense of what decks are playing the stuff that counters you and what decks aren't playing the stuff that counters you, this deck might actually get a little bit better. It tends to thrive when it knows its matchups, when it knows what's happening, and when it knows it can go over the top with no threat to actually be rug pulled down the end of the game. This is, I think, an extremely powerful list that will be a big part of metagame discussions going forward. Another list that I think is a holdover from past metagames is Supergiant. This is a pretty classic control list. It's the exact 12 from Unhelpful Yoda. I believe there's a featured set available with these cards right now, and it is a very strong deck. This is likely to be the successor to Techno-Organic Virus as the mid-range deck of the meta, but I do think that it is a lot more difficult to play than TOV was and has a lot less free wins. But it is an extremely powerful deck that does some really interesting and dynamic gameplay to it that a lot of other decks do not have. Supergiant has typically never propagated down the ranks of ladder the way something like TOV did, because TOV had so much more raw power. But right now, I haven't seen a TOV list that feels more convincing to me as a home of disruptive tech than this Supergiant list does right now. I think that this and the previous Captain Carter lists are your I am just trying to win right now and I don't want to play around and I don't want to experiment at all lists. But luckily for you, if that's not what you're into, basically every other list on this thing that we're going to be talking about in this video is going to be significantly weird. I've long maintained that Ongoing has traditionally been a deck that's underrated, even by me. Like, I think that this deck is basically always at a level that would justify it being included on tier lists, give or take a couple of cards. It's sort of always been some level of playable in some form. And while it may not be the best deck in the game, I've certainly given lip service to worse decks, right? Like, this is a deck that I think would actually justify that destroy meme spot at the end of the tier lists, where it's just never actually going to to be that bad. The specific card choices in here are mostly from a list I found on Untapped. I am not particularly married to Jeff or Sage here. They're just here for like additional support. The Jeff is like kind of cool, and I like being able to move stuff around, and I like having an additional 2-drop, and the Sage is not particularly great with our ongoing package, but I do prefer it over something like Spectrum. But those are definitely flex slots where you could play, you know, Juggernaut Cosmo, the Iron Lad, another flex slot. Again, those are the things you're going to be swapping in and out. But the core of cards here is a particularly strong one that can really go tall with the best of them right now, and that's a really relevant thing. You have these tech slots that you can swap in. I named the 3 cards that you can mess around with, and I think all of them would be reasonable things to take out to customize this deck to the metagame. And it can go tall as a lot of decks in this game. Like, you can get to 100-point output with Moonstone and Mystique. That's one of the few decks in the game that can really go power for power with a Zombie Galacti, with a Brood deck, and actually put them in the ground. That's a very difficult thing to do. It also gets to play a really solid mid-range game. I actually had a lot of success with this list. I was pretty surprised, but maybe I shouldn't be, because it just keeps showing up and being decent. This one's for the cragheads out there. Ika put together a weird Wiccan list, which feels a little bit to me like one of those early metagame syndrome kind of decks that's cool and interesting, but might not necessarily have staying power. But there was some really fun stuff going on here. Kraglin notably was just like, that's a pretty good card now. Like, it might not be an amazing card, but to me it feels pretty similar to like a copycat kind of thing, where it's like, if you're playing copycat, it might be Kraglin now. If you're playing Kraglin, it might be copycat, depending on what you're trying to do. But if you're in the market for just like 3 big, Kraglin seems really strong right now. Like, I think there's probably room to experiment with him in TOV lists as well, especially now that the 2 energy works so well with your additional TOV. Card just seems pretty good here, and this is a list that is trying to do a bunch of different things. Just get some extra energy. Instead of using Quinjet to discount your TOV, get some energy, and then you're getting TOV for free. And otherwise, just playing a fairly straightforward Wiccan-y game plan, which is fairly medium, but we are in a metagame that, like, to be completely honest with you, I didn't play a single deck that I felt like I loved. I didn't play a single deck that felt like I had the answers to everything. Like, I think it's easy to look at this video and say, oh, okay, well, the 2 super tryhard decks are the Galactus version of the Captain Carter combo deck and the version of Supergiant that Yoda played. But the Supergiant deck that Yoda played doesn't actually have an amazing matchup into the decks that are doing a bunch of turbo Techno-Organic Virus stuff. They actually can just outpoint you, and anything playing Shadow King has at least a puncher's chance if you're doing the Captain Carter combo stuff. So it did feel like there wasn't a one-size-fits-all solution for me when I was playing all these lists yesterday. Just a lot of stuff that made all of them feel like there were really pronounced weaknesses. So I don't know how long this interregnum will last as we're waiting for another deck to rise up and take over the metagame. But this felt way better than I would imagine a Wiccan deck should ever feel in 2026. I want to be super clear here. Mobius isn't dead, but the large shift that has happened in the metagame is a bunch of decks that were Mobius decks have become decks that are now weak to Mobius. And that means that one of the places you can exploit in this metagame is just play the thing that loses the hardest to Mobius, but does the most points to beat that stuff. And this is a list that I've seen a bunch of people playing. Jay Walla's been playing it. Moogs has been playing it. I think Butt has been playing it. And I've seen some, you know, there's kind of a running gag in my server where like Jay Walla doesn't get credit for anything and all this credit goes to everyone else involved. But I don't actually know the lineage of this list, but I've definitely played against Moogs playing it. And it seems like a really solid list that is doing some really solid things that absolutely lose to Mobius, but as long as nobody's doing that, you're kind of okay. Elektra's a really solid card when a bunch of people are relying on Quinjet. That was very dangerous for me as a Quinjet TOV gamer, was this Elektra thing, being able to do all of this powerful final turn stuff, float 5 with a Warlock, then you end up with an extremely cheap She-Hulk that is also making an extremely cheap Lady Bullseye. Some really big guys. You can do some really strong stuff with a list like this. I don't know that it's necessarily big enough to survive in a world where people are doing like big boy things, but it's really good at throwing priority into a Shadow King Grandmaster against the decks like Surfer. And this is kind of what I mean when I talk about the Captain Carter combo list. Like, You'd think it'd be immediately the best deck, but there's just so much splash hate because absolutely nobody stopped playing Shadow King. It was like a bunch of people stopped playing Mobius so they could go play Quinjet TOV, but all of those decks are playing Shadow King. And so you just end up with like a bunch of people who are still targeting the Surfer list because it's still just that good. And yeah, that's just a very actual serious thing to do right now is like, if you're playing something loses to Shadow King, you know, make sure you're really good at throwing priority. This deck is trying to take a sort of reactive role in those matchups, have the ability to just throw priority as hard as possible, deny all of the interaction that could possibly happen to you. And if they Mobius you, okay, at least you're not going to the cube double showdown and losing there. I've seen some people messing around with Cerebro 6 recently, which has some interesting things going for it with the addition of Crystal. This is already a deck that has kind of a lot of consistency tools. Malekith Grandmaster and now Crystal Grandmaster mean that you are really drawing through your deck when you play this one. It might be the deck that plays Cerebro that is the most consistent at getting to Cerebro. This list comes from Jay Walla, but Smiz was messing around with this, Cougar was messing around with this, Husky Puppies was messing around with this. There's a bunch of different things you can do, but the fundamental thing here is you just draw a bunch of cards and then output a bunch of points, and Cerebro seems like it's actually legitimately kind of solid right now. Triton is going to come out and ruin the fun, presumably, at some point, but this does seem like a genuinely functional deck that has meaningful reason to exist outside of other Cerebro lists. Like, typically, the Cerebro decks are defined by their relationship to the metagame in terms of tech cards. We're in a very early metagame right now. Nobody's sure what tech they're even supposed to be playing, so just execute your game plan as fast as possible, as consistently as possible. With Crystal, with Malekith, with Grandmaster, you are going to get to your Cerebro, and you might even be able to double it with Moonstone. This is a deck that can legitimately actually use Crystal in a very powerful way that compounds with what it's already doing, and as a deck built around one card, is exactly the kind of deck that wants to do that. From Husky Puppies, another list leaning really hard into the Quinjet TOV thing. This is a Hitmonkey list that is just looking to play as many techno-organic viruses as it possibly can, and that's a pretty strong thing to be doing. This is a list that I have seen get up to like genuinely 5 played TOVs, which sounds like a crazy thing to do, and it kind of is, but like there's some real power in doing something like that. This, again, I think a lot of the main dynamics that have changed with TOV, the fundamental one is that rather than being tied to Mobius, it's tied to Quinjet and weak to Mobius. So things like this have a much more pronounced weakness, but if nobody's taking advantage of it because everyone is doing things like this, the person who's doing things like this the hardest, the person who's cheating energy in the TOV space the hardest, well, they're going to beat the other TOV decks. And this is a deck that has a real shot at being the deck that is doing that, right? We've talked about other lists in the space. This is one of the ones that is the most aggressively set up to cheat as much energy as possible between Mother Askani and Quinjet. The fact that you're copying your cards off of Moongirl, the Sasquatch, the Black Swan. You are so dead to Mobius, but you are beating the other people that are dead to Mobius. Continuing on a theme here, I think that this is probably a very solid fun police list right now. You have your own Mobius to beat all the people that are going to be beating you with Mobius, and if everyone is not playing Mobius, it's a perfect time to bring back the Foot. Of course, that is the combination of Sasquatch and Victoria Hand. Now, I do think you could reasonably argue that you should be doing TOV instead of V Hand. I'm willing to believe that. I haven't seen enough proof, but I am super willing to believe it. This is a list that has a lot of interesting stuff going for it that I've kind of been messing around with. And I'm not super positive on a lot of the card choices. Like, Grandmaster is cool, but if I don't have Shadow King as the secondary target, it's kind of just a Mother Askani thing. But if I ever hit the Mother Askani, it's kind of incredible. I don't know. It's a pretty interesting list that has a lot of play to it. You can do a lot of things. You're trying to copy your V-Hand. You're trying to copy your Gambit. You're trying to copy your Sasquatch. You're just playing cards out and all of that. I wouldn't be shocked if there was a version at some point that emerged that was able to hybridize V-Hand and TOV better. I feel like Maria Hill comes a pretty close way towards like seriously bridging that in a meaningful way, but I haven't seen one that I love more than just playing some straightforward big cheap Sasquatches. Phantom X is a straightforward anti-meta deck, but right now I think you just get a lot of equity off of being one of the few decks that's actually playing Mobius and not relying on it. But at the same time, you are really stressed on that. These decks that the TOV stuff, they're gonna beat you if you are not going to be able to get to your Mobius in time, or in some cases to your Killmonger in time. But if you can, and you can deploy them in the right way, this feels like maybe the Sarah tech of the metagame, where if you're just looking for a deck that's able to say no to everything, just deny all of it. Just realized I could have said say no to Crag if I put a couple more Kraglin decks on here. That one's on me. But this is a deck that is basically about policing the metagame in an extremely straightforward sense. You just don't want your opponents to be able to output points, and you do everything you can, whether that be afflicting them with Marrow and Phantom X, or using a Shadow King on them, presumably before you use Marrow and Phantom X, or blowing them up with Gambit, or blowing them up with Killmonger, or stopping them from discounting a bunch of energy with Mobius. You get the idea. This is a deck that wants its opponents to not have fun. I think this list could be a bit of a sleeper. I think being a version of Juggernaut Cosmo move lists is pretty powerful. I enjoy the addition of Spider-Punk because my big objection to this list has always been, like, everything is so bad when you don't have a payoff, and Human Torch gives you like some play, and then you kind of really want it to be multiple man all the time, but you need to be able to play a larger percentage of games. And one of the big problems with this deck in ladder is that it just isn't able to play a large percentage of games, and it's very snap dependent because of that. And so adding the Spider Punk just so you have the ability to get yourself to a situation where Juggernaut can conceivably win a lane in more cases is just a really important thing to do, unfortunately. It's definitely the weakest of the payoffs, no arguments here, but you just kind of need to have enough payoffs to make any of this make sense. The multiple man stuff is so good, and you just don't need to invest that much in it. Just a Penny Parker will do it a lot of the time, that a lot of the additional investment felt superfluous, and additional payoffs were a little bit more valuable. All right, y'all. Thank you so much for watching. Honestly, I could have put even more decks on here. I think I saw so much stuff. I didn't find a single deck that I thought was like the one be all end all right now. Everything felt like it had weaknesses. I felt like I could play way worse decks than I previously was allowed to play. It's kind of crazy, honestly, what removing a deck that's like 7 tech cards from the metagame will do to make it feel more fun to play. Noted. And I do think that this is, it's day one. This is very likely to not continue this way. We'll find a meta predator at some point, but I haven't found it yet. And I think that right now that means that this is one of the most fun times you can play, as long as you aren't like me and you won't get frustrated with everything feeling mid. It's kind of interesting, right? I think a lot of other people get frustrated with things being like clearly better, but when you're playing in an early metagame and you're just like, I don't know what anyone is doing and it's all kind of bad, it's just very difficult to get a read on things. And I think that's not a perspective that's often expressed. I think most people default to the other one. And I definitely felt it yesterday. I was just playing a lot and it was like, I don't know what the hell's going on. Everyone's playing all sorts of weird stuff, and I don't know how real that is or how long it'll stay. And normally that happens in early metagames, but it felt way more pronounced right now. All right, y'all. As always, thank you so much for watching. I've been KMBest. You've been phenomenal. Remember to like, subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.